Okay, welcome back. It is June 6th of 2015. We're going to look at part 2 of Ricoeur's lesson on Psalm 22. He begins by looking at the existential plane, and he says that a recollection of salvation history at the intellectual level doesn't really answer abandonment being felt by humanity at the deep level of psyche. It just doesn't quite really reach a true answer to the why. So there is a pressing forward to more of a Book of Job type of existential predicament that is seeking an answer. And so the salvation of the history of the prophets is not sufficient, and a new interpretive theology must evolve to answer this existential doubt and this existential predicament, but it can't be at the level of gnosis. It has to be at the level of the psyche, where it truly will address abandonment by God. And so this divine inscrutability of a true answer needs to be postponed, and the self creates that third-party universality workspace where an answer can be appropriated in stages through the dialogue threshold of going out and return in dialogue. But there must be a vertical transcendent intersection of linear time. It can't just be a futurum as an answer. And so there must be some kind of an answer for this predicament, and for which is also in a signifying way spoken to in the destruction of the temple and in the experience of exile. So this withdrawal of God must be answered. A struggle must go forth for a new interpretive theology that can answer this predicament. Ricoeur says it's going to be a new interpretive theology that includes God's own suffering. We had a theology of the poor being unfolded for Lacocque, and now we're going to have a theology of God's suffering unfold by Ricoeur. So a theology of the poor and a theology of divine suffering. So on the theological plane, Ricoeur says the Christ event reactualizes the entirety of Psalm 22, not just abandonment in the beginning, but all the way to the end, where the unveiled kingdom creates certainty of faith. So it is a thematic taking up of the breaking through the kingdom, apocalyptic in nature, because the gospel writers did mention the cosmic signs that were present in the Christ event. But it does open up a whole new area of meaning, and we are reminded that this psalm of lament must be considered apart from simply an intellectual review of prophetic salvation history. We must look at the new dimension opened up in the Christ event and take on a new rereading that expands suffering servant. So we really address the energia and the dunamis power of the lament as a prayer, and in the Christ event, the suffering servant, as Son of Man, raises his suffering to a suffering for all of humanity. So the taking up of Psalm 22 is understood as the suffering of Yahweh, the covenant God, through Christ, in a taking up of the abandonment that humanity experiences, and actually Yahweh himself entering into abandonment to answer that predicament. So through Christ's abandonment, all those who are abandoned find their promise of an answer and their promise of fulfillment, because Christ entered into abandonment to answer and to gain victory over abandonment. And so it is a theology of God's own suffering that can be coupled with the theology of the poor that Lacocque brought out. But it is most definitely Yahweh, the covenant God, who actually, through incarnation, enters into not just the elementary level of suffering, but Yahweh, the covenant God, enters into the absolute abandonment of humanity that humanity experiences. Yahweh himself enters into this suffering of abandonment through Christ crying out in abandonment on the cross. And so Ricoeur says in the third moment here, abandonment by God always must be preserved when we look at Psalm 22. You can't water it down. You can't exclude it. You can't weaken it. True abandonment by God must be taken up because God must enter that deeply into human suffering. So you can't water down Psalm 22. God, Yahweh, God of the covenant, enters into the abandonment felt by all of humanity, the absolute cutting away and cut off from the divine. That horrible abandonment is taken up by God himself in order to gain power over it, in order to free humanity. So we can't water it down. Abandonment by God must be preserved. No simplistic theology will work. It must be negated. Anything simplistic must be negated. And we must instead prioritize the expectation of the kingdom in spite of inner conflict, in spite of the hiddenness of the teleology of soteria. We still must emphasize the expectation and the hope that Psalm 22 does bring the believer in the end through that trajectory toward praise. So it is a lament that is unfolding toward praise. It is a struggle for renewed trust, which must be renewed again, again, and again as the individual passes through these three modalities. But there is, of course, a praxis toward the poor because the theology of the poor is prioritized in the psalm. So the poor become the first, not the last, and all those who suffer are viewed as just truly suffering and not guilty of not suffering because they have sinned, but suffering and in need of an answer that answers abandonment. And once we do that, we do return again to the existential plane and begin the process again because it is a dialectic. This loop will run many, many times, and we will continue to work on that third-party universality of workspace where we continue to fill up that divine inscrutability because we will slowly and progressively get glimpses of the meaning of Yahweh. And we will fill that inscrutability, but not in a quick and simplistic way, but through struggle. For Ricoeur, the dialectic is a struggle. It's a struggle for the manifestation of Yahweh, the covenant God. But that manifestation isn't the overly simplistically presented. The manifestation of Yahweh, the covenant God, and his telos of soteria evolves through struggle, through praxis, through entering into the struggle of the poor, and then through the return out of that struggle and that mission, we gain more truth concerning the inscrutability of the content for Yahweh, the covenant God, in order to work out our answer of abandonment. But fundamentally, it does rest on two theological points, that the theology of the poor is prioritized over the theology of the privileged priests, and that the theology of a distant and untouchable God is overcome by the theology of a God who takes up suffering himself through Christ to the point of the very depth of abandonment on the cross. God enters into abandonment itself in order to overcome it. So privilege is overcome by poor, and a distant, non-relational God is overcome by a relational God who actually enters into the suffering of humanity in order to overcome the suffering of all humanity. So it's a complete radical change in theology that took place in 1st century Jerusalem and 1st century Antioch, a radical change in how we view God, Yahweh, the covenant God, how the privileged are getting squeezed out, the priesthood will die away, but also how the reinterpretations must preserve that concept of abandonment. God must be seen as actually entering into the most extreme and most excessive type of suffering itself, abandonment in shame on the cross. It's taken up by the divine through the Christ event. And that is a taking up that addresses the entire psalm all the way toward the thread of trajectory toward praise, which of course is going to align itself with the resurrection and the Christ event. So it's crucifixion and abandonment, and then resurrection as that trajectory toward praise, that both are both poles of Psalm 22, and both are reintegrated within 1st century Jerusalem and 1st century Antioch, where the Christ event helps to interpret Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 helps to interpret the Christ event. They both reciprocally work on each other and inform each other, but fundamentally it's going to be a theology of God entering into the suffering of all humanity to the very, very depth of abandonment itself. So it's we frequently talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection overcoming death, but we should probably be more appropriately responding and saying that the crucifixion and the resurrection of the Christ event answer the abandonment by God, that God enters that deeply into the existential suffering of all humanity to the very depth of hell itself, to the very depth of abandonment. That deeply does the Christ event